along as we continue in our study through 1 Thessalonians. We're in chapter 4, and we're going to talk about the rapture of the church today. This was one of the things that Paul had wanted to address with the church, and this was one of the this was one of his topics. You could say it's one of his lead up to topics when he says finally. First, remember he talked about them preserving their bodies in sanctification and in honor. Kind of interesting because of the promise of the rapture, and I'll get more into that. And then he tells them to mind their own business. Now, when he says mind their own business, meaning work, take care of yourself, not to be a busybody. In other words, they should be working, and to take care of themselves, they should be working, supporting themselves, and not being a burden to other people. Now that's kind of interesting, and that kind of goes to there are people who sort of think that the church is sort of there for them. We talked about this a bit about giving to the church, supporting the church. That the church really is not your rainy day fund. Once you give to the church, then that money becomes the property or the possession of the church. It's a gift. And only reason why I'm saying that is because I do hear people say, I'm tithing, so why can't, and they say that as if they are entitled to the tithe or an offerings that they give, that they are entitled. Excuse me, they're not. Excuse me. So the answer to that is you work and support yourself, okay? And so now in verse 13, this is another why what he wanted to get to, what he wanted to talk about as far as in this letter, some concerns he had. Let me say this. When we talk about the rapture of the church, we talk about the second coming, because he's going to talk about both in this epistle, and then also in the second epistle. And what's interesting is that we're talking about this from Paul's perspective as he is addressing the church. When we talk about prophecy, and if you go back, we've studied the book of Daniel, the book of Revelation, and one of the things about prophecy, it is not difficult. It is not hard to understand. Like the book of Revelation is not hard to understand. I was always told how scary the book of Revelation is. It's how difficult, and people now think that reading the book of Revelation is hard, but it's not. What makes it hard is preconceived notions. Reading it through the lens of your theological background instead of just reading the book itself. Prophecy is exhaustive, but you can kind of sum it up into a very general kind of message. It is the message of God speaking what's going to happen primarily to Israel, his promises to Israel, and then everything that's surrounded that. There's some, you could say, subplots, but the main plot is that God what what he has spoken from the beginning concerning the end of days, and the end of days as he concludes the end of days. You could say the end of days as he regulates. Since one of the ways of understanding it, I think in a simple way, is to understand Daniel's 70 weeks. I'm not going to go there now, but understanding Daniel's 70 weeks, because Daniel's 70 weeks was a prophetic timetable that brings us up to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And basically, as Daniel said, or the angel was explaining to Daniel, that it was 70 sets of 7-year periods. But then he said concerning Israel, concerning Jerusalem. So again, the end time prophecies in general are about the relationship or the fulfilling of prophecy, things spoken that God has spoken concerning the nation of Israel. Now, what is interesting, as Paul is writing, remember this is a Gentile church, and Paul adds the revelation given to him concerning the Gentile church, which we are all Gentiles, and if you Gentile simply the non-Jew. There are some things about the church age that need to be understood, and so when we talk about the rapture of the church, one of the things is that the rapture of the church is the rapture of the church is a New Testament concept. Okay, it is a New Testament concept. I'll get more into some of the pros and cons, or those who agree and disagree with the rapture, what it is and all that. Some of the arguments, in my opinion, again, are quite silly, but we'll give them their due. First Thessalonians chapter 4, this is how he is going to lead up into this. He says, verse 13, "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, concerning those who are asleep or who have died, so that you will not grieve like the rest who have no hope." One of the issues, and again, this kind of came with those begin to, again, kind of go back. I'm kind of rethinking my thing here. I think I'm going to go back to Daniel. I'm going to go back to Daniel, because it's kind of interesting to understand what I'm getting ready to say. One of the interesting things about the prophecy, if you in understanding during this time, this first century church. Let me preface this by this. I'm on my way back to Daniel. Let me go back. I'm going to start at Acts 1. Acts chapter 1. Now this is, as Luke is reporting this, literally moments before Jesus is getting ready to ascend into heaven. And verse 6 says, "So when they had come together, they asked him, 'Lord, at this time are you restoring the kingdom to Israel?'" Now, think about that statement. Are you restoring the kingdom to Israel? Now, the reason why they're asking that is because there was a high expectation for the Messiah to come. When John the Baptist came on the scene, they immediately said, "Is this the Messiah? Is the kingdom of heaven near?" See if I can find this in Luke Gospel. Um, in Luke chapter 22, this is kind of interesting. In verse 24, now this is even a more solemn night. This is the night in which he's being betrayed. It says, then a dispute also arose among them about who should be considered greatest. And then basically there was another one, if I can find, where they asked him who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Let me see. And then there was the incident where the sons of Zebedee and their mother tried to pull a fast one. They tried to corner Jesus and say, Jesus, she said, what? I want to ask you something. I want you to do something for me. And he go, what do you want me to do for you? And then they said that my sons, the both of them, will be put in your kingdom, to be sit in your kingdom on your right hand and on your left hand. And so the reason why I'm citing all of this is because, again, there was this high expectation, especially when Jesus came on the scene, about the coming of Jesus. I'm going to go to Daniel chapter 9. And I want to kind of show you why they thought that. And there's some interesting things about why they thought and expected for Jesus to come. Why some people were disappointed when he was crucified. There was this sort of a dashing of the hope, right? And it's interesting because it wasn't that they were, if you remember that there was the time between his death and resurrection was probably the darkest time between, for them, because their hope, we got to go back to our lives. The Messiah is not here. Maybe we're going to get hunted down. The Pharisees are going to, kill us, so forth and so on. Now, what's interesting that probably what they were most disappointed over was that Jesus did not turn out to be the Messiah in their minds. He was the Messiah, and that he wasn't, taking his place on the throne, as it were, and breaking the neck, breaking the foot of Rome off of Israel and restoring Israel to its glories as in the days of David. And that was probably the most of why their hopes were dashed. So then when you even go over to the book of Acts, to the new church, the early church, there was always sort of this expectation that Jesus was going to come back in their time. And this is what Paul was writing to them about, is that they were worried because some of their loved ones were dying, right, as time was going on. It had been some 15 years since Jesus, you figure about 15 years or so between the resurrection, the ascension of Jesus into heaven. Now, as some were dying, then they were kind of like, are they going to miss it? And we'll come back to this, but this is what he was talking about. I want to read this. I want to read this kind of quickly in Daniel's chapter 9, and then in verse number 24, it says, 70 weeks are decreed about your people, your holy city, to bring the rebellion to an end, to stop their sin, to wipe away injustice, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to set up the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So notice he says 7 weeks is decreed about your people, and the holy city. So these 70 weeks are what? Prophecy about Israel, what's going to happen to Israel. Then he says, verse 25, know and understand this, from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, or 69 weeks. Now remember, this week here is 1 week equals 7 years. So basically talking about 70 sets of 7, or 70 sets of 7 year period of times, totaling 490 years. Now, what's also interesting, remember the timing of this prophecy was they had already passed kingdoms from the Babylonians. The Medes and Persians had already conquered the Babylonian kingdom. Daniel is also now realizing the 70 years are almost up. So this is kind of a major sign here, is that when Cyrus will issue the decree to go for the Jews to return to their land and to rebuild Israel, this prophetic clock starts 70 weeks. It starts. Okay? Now, verse 26, after 62 weeks, Messiah will be cut off and will have nothing to the people. And then I'm skipping here because notice, from a prophetic kind of locator, during the time of Jesus, that meant, hey, we're in week 69, and week, oh, hey, Carolyn, how you doing? God bless you, sister. 69 weeks have passed, so right there they can say, here's where we are. Okay, so then in verse 27, he says he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and an offering, and the abomination of desolation will be on the wing of the temple. Now, this abomination that makes desolate, Jesus reference. Okay, Jesus reference. I'm going to go there quickly. Jesus in Matthew chapter 24. Now, the reason I'm kind of taking a little time to go through this is because to try to make sense of, again, why there was a misunderstanding. Why there was a misunderstanding of expectation, or I should say misplaced expectation. Now in chapter 24, Miss Tori, how are you doing? For those of you I don't know, Miss Tori is my daughter who just got married, Miss Tori. All right. So in Matthew chapter 24, I'm going to start reading, but I'm not going to, again, read this whole chapter. I just want to give a good understanding. It says, as Jesus left and was going out of the temple complex, his disciples came and called his attention to the temple buildings. Then he replied to them, don't you see all these things? I assure you, not one stone will be left here upon another that will not be thrown down. And while he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, his disciples approached him privately and said, tell us, when will these things happen, and what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now remember, this discussion then, Jesus is answering three questions, right, that they asked. When will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? Now, I want to skip down and just show you something. In verse 15, he says, so when you see the abomination that causes desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel. Now, the reason why I wanted to read that is because notice this abomination that makes desolate hasn't happened yet at the time of Matthew 24. Okay? So there, it hasn't happened during this time. All right? So which means the 70th week of Daniel, we're still waiting for. Okay, so now when we get into the early church, they're still wondering how come Jesus is not going to restore the nation of Israel. Well, you still got one more week, okay? The 70th week. Okay, so now when we go back to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, he says, verse 13 again, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, concerning those who are asleep, so that you will not grieve like the rest who have no hope. So again, there was this great expectation. Many thought Jesus was returning during that time. In other words, they really thought that he was going to come. Now, where they misunderstood or misread the signs of the time is this 70th week hasn't happened yet. See, this one of the things about prophecy, which is kind of, again, we always forget that when we look at the Bible now, our modern day production of the Bible, we have everything binded in one book. Now, the reason why I'm saying that is because there are 66 books written over a 1,500 year period of time. In other words, these are 66 distinct documents. Okay? 66 distinct documents. And so, and they, again, so they range from different ages. So now if eight ages. So if you are reading, if you were reading in the time of Isaiah, which was about 120 some years before the Babylonian exile, right? You could say, okay, at that period of time, this was written before then, God had prophesied the Babylonians would come. And then all of a sudden you could say, okay, we're here, we're located here. When Daniel, who was one of the original people who were deported deported to Babylonian, okay, and as he's reading, okay, he's studying, for example, people like prophecies like Jeremiah that says 70 years are going to be decreed. He's reading that. He's actually reading this document. Remember, he's reading at the time almost a 70, well, probably a little more, a 70-year document, the prophecies of Jeremiah. Okay, so now as Daniel is receiving the prophecy from the angels, so these, for example, these 70 weeks the 70 weeks or 7 sets of 7-year period of times, totaling 490 years. That 70 weeks or 70 sets of 77-year period of times began when Cyrus the king, the Median Persian king, gave the decree, the order for the Jews to go back and restore Israel or Jerusalem. Okay. Now, if you're reading the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, that is the fulfillment of that. Now, it also began that 490-year period of time, which at the time of, again, Jesus, which was 69 weeks of those periods. A funny thing happened, though. All of a sudden, there was a pause in this prophetic time. So right now, where we are, right now, we are between week 69 and week 70. Now, how do we know that? Well, the Messiah is cut off, so we know that's week 69. But we also know that the abomination that makes desolate hasn't happened yet. So we know that. Now, we're going to get more into that, about that again in the second epistle. But you can also see, if you were just kind of reading that, you don't see this gap. You don't see this pause. And the reason why you don't see this pause, let me read it again in Ephesians chapter 2. No. Ephesians chapter 3. Something happened here that wasn't in the prophecy of the Old Testament. So anytime you hear people talk about prophecy, anytime you hear people, like now, people are looking at the peace accord that President Trump brokered. Okay, and so is that a significant prophetic development? No, it's not. Okay, but let me tell you why. Okay, let me tell you why. In Ephesians chapter 3, in verse 2, he says, "You have heard, haven't you, about the administration of God's grace that he gave to me for you." So this administration. He said, verse 3, "The mystery was made known to me by revelation, as I have briefly written. By reading this, you may understand my insight about the mystery of the Messiah. This was not made known to people in other generations, as it is now revealed to his holy apostles and prophets by the spirits, that the Gentiles should be co-heirs and members of the same body and partners of the promise of Jesus Christ." Now, here he's speaking about the tension, the contention between the Jews and the Gentiles during the first century. Now, and that contention, which is amazing, the Jerusalem believers never really fully accepted the Gentiles. So at least there was always contention there, because for the first 10 years they didn't even think the Gentiles could be saved. But I'm going to read something else in Romans chapter 11. In verse 25, he says, "So that you will not be conceited, brothers, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery." By the way, the word mystery here simply means it is a hidden truth. It is not hidden from us, it is hidden for us. That's what this word mystery means. He says, "So that you will not be conceited, brothers, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery. A partial hardening has come to Israel, until the full number of the Gentiles has come in." Okay, so a part of this mystery is, in a sense, God pausing this prophetic clock, and then he slips in this mystery, right? It wasn't revealed, notice he said, in times past. So one of the ways that you have to kind of measure where you are, or where we are prophetically, you got to look at the mystery. So you can't look at world events because things may or may not develop, like the peace broker, this peace deal that President Trump brokered. People look at that as a sign. Well, wait a minute. You have to look at, are we through with the church age? Are we through with the mystery? When Israel became a nation in 1948, because of there were some other, I think, misinterpretations of Scripture. Like, for example, you go back to Matthew chapter 24. We didn't get into that, but Matthew chapter 24. When you go back to that and you see that he talks about the fig tree, he talks about the signs of the time, reading the signs of the time. Well, they go back and they says, well, for some reason someone came out and says, well, when Jesus says, when you see all these things happen, and the things he was referring to was everything he talked about in that chapter. And remember, he was answering 3 questions in that chapter. When was going to be the destruction of the temple? When was going to be the sign of the end, and of the end of the world? He's coming. He's coming. He says, when you see all of these things, then know that the time is at hand. And then he gives the illustration of a fig tree. So a lot of people thought that the fig tree represented Israel. And then someone came along and said, well, see, when Israel became a nation, that was the fig tree blooming. So there, the generation that saw Israel becoming a nation was going to see the second coming of Jesus. Where did they get that from? I don't know. There's nowhere in Scripture that is in there. I mean, but they got it. Okay. So then someone also came up with the idea that a generation is 40 years. Again, I don't know where in the world they got that number from. So then in 1948, if you say that Israel became a nation in 1948, well, if a generation is 40 years, then 1988 should have been the return of Christ. And yes, there were people who were saying in 1988, actually before then, that Jesus is coming back in 1988. Well, now we are, almost going on 40 years after that, which is interesting, right? But all of that, again, is a misunderstanding of, misreading the times. And by the way, this is not, I think almost every generation we've had people predicting the end, right? Every generation somebody comes along and says, Jesus is going to come back during this time. Now, the beauty of this letter is, as I said before, even if you thought, which I think is always wrong, but even if you thought you had a date, even if you thought that you were one of God's special people, and that the fact that he said that no one knows the day and hour, well, you're special, and guess what? It doesn't apply to you. So even if you thought there was a date and you came up with a date, that's still what actions should that spawn in people. And what Paul was saying here, that there were people who were not working. There were people who were not, they were being a burden to the church. You have even today that there are people who would say, oh, Jesus is coming back, so let me quit my job, let me cash out of my retirement funds or empty out my bank accounts. And another strange thing is that they always seem to say, let's give it to the church, give it to the pastor. Or they're going to say, let's give it to the church, the pastor, and everybody lives in a communal situation in the basement of somebody's church or out in a field someplace waiting for Jesus to come. And as we see, he says, no, don't do that. There's no reason you should stop doing whatever it is that you're doing, other than maybe laboring more to get more people into the kingdom of God, preaching the kingdom of God more. And then of course he comes back here and he says that there were people who were concerned that their loved ones who were dying was going to miss the rapture or miss the second coming. And notice he says this back in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, we don't want you to be uninformed. Verse 13 again, we don't want you to be uninformed, brothers, concerning those who are asleep, so that you would not grieve like the rest who have no hope. I want to say this, and we'll pick it back up in verse 14 in our next study. Notice he said that we should not grieve like the rest who have no hope. And that's the kind of statement. Remember, there are a lot of times people who think that grieving is unscriptural. And yes, there are people who actually taught that you don't have to grieve for your loved one if they pass away. And that's not what he said here at all. What he said was, don't grieve like those who don't have hope. We have hope. But he didn't say that you're not going to have an emotional response to a loved one who has passed away. All right, we're going to pick it up, guys, in the next study in verse 14. And we're going to move on with that. I guess it turned out this way. I at least got some groundwork laid so that we can, again, talk about what the rapture is. All right, guys, thanks everybody for tuning in. We will see you in the next study. So I'll see you then. All right.